Chapter 31. When the lift finally reached the bottom, Shauna turned to see the three scientists standing a few meters away. Jay's face had gone pale, but she supposed all of them looked terrified. "You made it," Kate said with a smile. Shauna nodded. "Yeah, okay, we need to—" A shout echoed down the shaft, although it was completely unintelligible, and the four turned their heads toward the sound. Another volley of noise drifted down into the quiet quarantine level. "Jesus," Jay said, his voice tight and timid. "It's killing them." "We have to move," Shauna said. "Where?" Shauna turned to look at Kate and finally realized where they were. The lift connecting the lab to the quarantine area had deposited them in a safe room. Well, not safe exactly. It was little more than another lab. Sealed, metal, glass, locked from the outside. They were trapped. Shit. Shauna stepped to the pressure door separating them from the rest of the level. The word unauthorized glowed like an epithet from the control panel. Shauna put her bracelet against the sensor. The door buzzed angrily, and the word blinked before steadying. Fighting panic, she let her eyes take in the entire door. Then she saw an intercom. She punched the button and yelled, "Hey, anyone there?" No response. Beyond the quarantine enclosure's glass windows, the brightly lit observation area was completely deserted. Before its lights had been blown out, the science lab had been filled with light and devoid of shadow. This part of the quarantine level was barely illuminated past the confines of the relatively small isolation cubicle. As it was, the four of them stood less than half a meter apart, the walls uncomfortably close. "Where the hell are they?" Jay asked. Shauna stabbed the button again. "Hello? We're in the isolation room. We're not infected, but we need help." No response. Neil shivered and crossed his arms. What if there's no one on this level because of the lockdown?" Shaking her head, Kate pointed at the glass separating them from the rest of the level. "They're supposed to have guards on this level at all times, but in here? Probably not a big concern unless the alarms were tripped." The alarms were tripped," Jay said. "So where the hell are they?" Shauna thought for a moment and pressed the button. When the light turned green, she cleared her throat and spoke very slowly. "Moore, if you can hear me, we're trapped in the isolation room. Can you disengage the locks?" She released the button and stepped away as though it might bite her. The silence lingered, the whoosh of an unseen air circulation system the only stimuli apart from their labored breathing and the dim sounds from the shaft. Sighing, Shauna stepped back to the intercom and moved to press the button.
"More here."
The voice made the four of them jump. A staticky crackle floated beneath her words.
"My apologies for the delay."
The light above the airlock turned green and the pressure seals disengaged.
"I had to make sure none of you were infected."
"Of course we're not infected," Jay said. "The fucking thing is still up there."
"Yes, it is. For now."
Shauna's spine tingled. "For now?"
"Please exit the room."
Jay opened his mouth to ask another question or maybe yell a stream of curses, but Kate pushed him to the open hatch. The four of them stepped through the isolation airlock and into the observation hallway. The hatch shut behind them, red lights glowing above the steel.
"We have lost the science level,"
Moore's disembodied voice said over the PA.
"I have no way to know what has happened there, much less the situation."
Shauna found the comms panel and activated it, eliminating the need for an intercom button. "What about engineering?"
"Engineering is secure, apart from an air shaft Mr. Stanley and Mr. Givens used to make their way to the science level."
That tingling feeling turned to ice. What? What do you mean?"
"Mr. Stanley and Mr. Givens descended to the science level some time ago. They have not reported in."
"Great," Jay said. "Our rescuers." "What do we do now?" Kate asked. "We can't go back up."
"No, that would be unwise. May I suggest you activate the UV lights in the isolation room in case M2 decides to escape using the lift shaft?"
Shit. Shauna turned and looked at the control panel. She quickly found a label marked UV and pressed it. The isolation room's interior became intolerably bright through the observation windows. "Okay, now how the hell do we get out of here?"
"You don't."
Kate and Shauna exchanged a glance. Lip quivering, Kate cleared her throat. "What do you mean, we don't?"
"You don't leave the level until the escaped M2 creature is destroyed."
Neil pounded a fist on the control panel. "And how do we do that?"
"I suggest that you make your way to the blast door. I'll alert the remaining guards on the level that you are on your way there."
"Fan-fucking-tastic," Jay said. Can't believe you didn't send them to let us out. When Moore spoke again, Shauna suddenly realized how much trouble they were really in.
They have been busy. We have a possible containment breach, which is another reason you should make your way to the blast door immediately.
Oh shit, Shauna said. You said remaining guards. Jay's eyes widened, his face growing more pale. What does? Neil grabbed him by the shoulder and pushed him toward the observation room's exit, while Jay stuttered. Shauna stared at the speaker in the ceiling. How bad is it?
Please leave the observation area now.
Kate tugged at her shoulder, and Shauna finally turned. Without a word, they headed through the open hatch and into the corridor beyond. Red warning blinkers flashed on the walls, and the overheads filled the world with incredibly bright white light. Moore's eyes flicked from one feed to another as she desperately searched for egress points to protect, ways M2 could get out. Her monitor displayed the old blueprints of the facility's quarantine level. It was the last level before the maintenance floor and the foundation upon which the facility had been built. The air shafts were the logical weak points, so those had been the first areas mined with thermite and Semtex. According to her other engineering consultants, none of whom could examine the facility nor know its exact nature, an explosion in the air shaft shouldn't cause a breach in the steel and concrete walls protecting the facility from the water table. That, however, was little comfort. The moment she'd visited the facility's quarantine and maintenance levels, she'd known all bets were off. Cracks, water leakage, any significant explosion might create spider webs of fissures in the thick walls. The water would begin seeping through cracks, further damaging the concrete until leaks became streams, then rivers. The Taub descendant was loose on the science level, but she could do little about that. The trick would be finding a way to extract the survivors without breaking containment. Containment's already broken, she said aloud, eyes still dancing from one feed to another. The Taub creature broke through to the remaining glass shield. If it managed to fracture it, she'd have no choice but to detonate the set of explosives ringing the lowest level, followed by quarantine, followed by science, and at last, destroying the engineering level. All of it. Collapse the entire fucking facility into the earth itself. If M2 managed to survive that, it might crawl back to where it came from. Fat chance. The facility was decades old, and its security measures were not meant for something like M2. It had not been designed to contain a creature that grows and grows with everything consumable it touches. A creature that can change its form to fit purpose and adapt faster than its human captors. M2 was smarter than they'd suspected and intelligent enough to form strategies and avoid obstacles, all while feeding and feeding and feeding. I should have destroyed you before they had a chance to bring you here. Moore wiped the moisture from her eyes and forced herself to focus. There had to be a way. Just had to be. Catfish repeatedly hit the lift controls, but they didn't respond. Fuck! His voice echoed in the mostly enclosed space, hurting his ears. Another bolt of pain rose from his damaged foot, clouding his vision with stars. Something metal clanged outside the airlock and Catfish froze, his flashlight shivering in his hands. He waited in the dark and the ensuing silence for the sound to come again. He didn't have to wait long. It sounded like metal sliding across metal. No clicks, no static, nothing that sounded like M2. He turned and faced the airlock, sweat dripping from his forehead despite the coolness of the room. The clang and slide didn't come again, but he heard footfalls, combat boots on the raised floor. He stuck his head out of the airlock, half expecting a tentacle to cleave it, and shined the light toward the sound. Sarah approached from the equipment racks. Her clothes were covered in grime, torn in places, and her face lacerated by God knew what. Her incinerator dangled from her hands, its blue pilot light no longer lit. She smiled at him. Holy shit, he said. You made it. Yeah, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He moved out of the airlock, wincing with each step. With the adrenaline no longer spiking through his bloodstream, the pain and fatigue were descending on him like a shroud. You okay? He asked between clenched teeth. Sarah limped, and one of her arms hung straight down as if she couldn't move it. Dandy, she said, shrugging the incinerator off her shoulders. It clanged to the ground with an echoing metallic bang. It went into the lab. He nodded, although he wasn't sure she could see him. It went down the shaft. The head of security froze in her tracks. Her head slowly tipped back before she howled in rage. When she looked back at him, her eyes looked dazed instead of sharp with anger. He made his way to her and put his arm around her waist. Sit down, he said, before you fall down. He guided her to the blast door, separating them from the elevator corridor. The thick steel was still in place, blocking their egress, but at least it was something to rest their backs against. When he had her situated, he sat less than a meter away. The room's silence was creepy, especially without the normally pervasive hum of equipment. It was like sitting in an abyss with a penlight to illuminate it. "Did Shauna and the science team make it out okay?" Sarah asked, her eyes closed. "Yeah," he said. He turned off his flashlight. Damn thing was doing little more than flickering now. Cheap piece of shit. "That's the problem. M2 went down there too." "I heard you," Sarah sighed. "At least they have power. If the UV lights are still working, they should be able to keep it enclosed." Catfish chuckled, but it sounded more like a sob. "It doesn't give a damn about UV anymore. It's beyond that. Did you even manage to hurt it with fire?" She was silent for a moment. "Only when it was stupid enough to show us something we could hit. We blasted it, all three of us, and torched the shit out of it. It destroyed the generator and leaped into the vents. Didn't see it after that until you and—" Her voice broke off, and he could hear her trying not to cry. "Until you came out." He nodded in the dark. "Must have split itself or something." "Split?" "Yeah." Catfish scratched at the prickling, itching cuts and burns on his arm. "I burned the one that was coming for me, but another one was behind it and on the other side of the vent. That's the one that followed us out." He winced, realizing he'd said us. "We might be fucked," Sarah said. "If it comes back, we have nothing left to fight it with. All the incinerators apart from yours are drained. We're nearly down to harsh language." "Did that work at Bentob?" She laughed, but it had no mirth in it. "No, it didn't." They were silent for a moment. "So we just die here?" "Yup," Sarah said. "This is where we die, if they don't stop it." Catfish's lip trembled. Meters below him, surrounded by steel and concrete and blocked off from any possible exit, Shauna and the science team were at the mercy of the M2 entity. He was betting it was hungry after its attack and the damage that had been done to it, if it had been damaged at all. His boot was becoming painfully tight from swelling. To make matters worse, the trickle of liquid he felt on his toes had to be blood. He'd probably split his remaining stitches and reopened the wound. He tried to move, but the pain hit him like a truck. "Well," he said through a groan, "if it comes back, serve me up for dinner. I'm not going anywhere." "Same," she said. "Dislocated my arm." He laughed. "Maybe I'll get some sleep." "No sleep," she said with a yawn. "Shock, no sleep. Not yet." Catfish closed his eyes anyway and moved his hand. He found her palm and put his fingers in hers. She cringed at first and then clenched his hand. Not love, not want. Just two human beings trying to take comfort while they waited to die. "Grenades," Sarah muttered a moment later. He yawned and stared at her. "What?" She stirred and her eyes blinked owlishly. "Forgot we still have grenades." The blast door boomed as the locking mechanism clicked open. Prime knew the light was dangerous. It protected itself by growing a thicker carapace before dropping into the room and curling its long body beneath itself. Within its hard shell, the creature reformed, hardened new limbs, and finally extruded them from its thorax. The creature extruded a solid hood over itself and grew a short eye stalk beneath it. The overhang kept the UV light from directly smashing into its vulnerable liquid form. Tendrils of vapor still rose from the eye stalk, the ambient light almost setting it ablaze, but it only needed the appendage for a second or two before it reabsorbed the sensory organ and the hood. The incongruous lump of alien shell rippled as two thick limbs formed, each of their ends becoming disturbingly like human hands with long talons for fingertips. It pulled itself to the wall where it had seen the glass, the same kind of glass that had imprisoned it in the place of its birth. It had seen that barrier shatter and knew it could do the same. Static filled the room as its liquid belly absorbed flakes of dead skin, construction debris, traces of old cleaning chemicals, and plastic. Not the meal it wanted, but it would have to do for now. The creature reached the wall, and a single limb with a wide, flipper-like end emerged from its belly. Prime hardened the shell around the new appendage and its vulnerable underside. The creature deflated as it shifted more and more of its mass to its ventral side. Then it pushed. The wide flipper acted like a foot, giving Prime enough leverage to raise itself. When it was at the right height, it swung its makeshift arms before springing them into the glass. The sharp talons crashed into the transparent barrier, spider webs of cracks suddenly covering the observation windows. Prime swung its limbs repeatedly, the flipper broadening to provide more leverage and allowing the creature to rock back and forth for more power. Prime smashed at the glass 5 more times, its limbs wheeling backward before swinging over its head and crunching into the window. Vapor rose from its body, the harsh UV lights burning off its outer shell. It couldn't stay in here forever. It had to escape before it expended too much of its mass. It also knew what was beyond the room. It sensed another to help it become. Prime felt the glass give way in an explosion of material, a brief rain of shards pattering over its shell. The creature's arms stopped swinging and moved forward through the glass. The finger-like appendages experimentally gripped the edge of the sill, the digits digging their talons into the soft plastic and aluminum of the console. It reabsorbed the foot back into its belly and pulled itself into the observation room. The vapor stopped pouring from its back when it struck the steel floor. It was safe now. The quarantine room filled with static as it consumed everything it could. The other was closer now. All Prime had to do was find it. Chapter 32. A klaxon screamed from the embedded speakers, making conversation nearly impossible. Warning lights flashed red in an ominous strobe, giving the bright white overheads a pink tinge. They moved past stacks of storage crates, Kate shepherding them toward the blast door and the elevator corridor. Shauna looked past the surplus incinerator tanks, thick sheets of aluminum and instant concrete, her eyes focusing on the containment room beyond. 3 figures stood near the thick steel enclosure's door, their incinerator blue pilot teardrops visible even under the assault of the UV lights. She wasn't sure, but she thought one of the men was shaking either from adrenaline or fear. She nearly bumped into one of the crates when a large dimple appeared on the steel wall. The 3 soldiers jumped back, and Shauna stopped in her tracks. Another dimple appeared with a low boom that caught the barest edge of her hearing. "What the?" Jay said, his head turning in that direction. One of the soldiers yelled, and the sound of shattering glass echoed through the room. A dark shape flipped through the broken entry door, and the 3 incinerators came to life. The blasts of fire washed over a shadowy limb. The soldiers' yells rose above the crackle and whoosh of the jets of flame. A large, dark, amorphous form scuttled out of the room and lunged at the closest man. The tentacle they'd been firing upon whipped and took out the legs of one of the soldiers. He fell backward to the floor, his feet no longer attached to his body. His incinerator went out as he crumpled to the deck just before the tentacle whipped again and removed his head. The remaining guards shuffled backward, trying to escape the creature, but it was moving too fast. Instead of focusing on the tentacle, they concentrated their fire on the creature's hardened shell, the flames licking impotently off the surface. The tentacle's hook slashed and cut one of the men in 2 at the waist. The remaining guard turned to run. The tentacle flashed again and buried its hook in the man's back. Shauna screamed. The incinerators were out. The 3 guards were down. The crackle and spit of static filled the room as the creature, still smoking and surrounded by a veil of heat haze, plopped down on the first body. She watched in horrified fascination as the body disappeared and the creature grew larger. In less than 5 seconds, it had completely consumed the corpse and was moving to the next. "Run!" Kate yelled. Shauna finally tore her eyes away from the sight and followed the scientists through the maze of crates to the blast door. When they were less than 5 meters from the thick metal door separating them from the elevator corridor, a loud boom echoed out of the quarantine observation room, accompanied by the tinkle of broken glass on metal. The 4 scientists, panting and puffing, turned as one to peer over the clutter of crates and supplies. Something was coming out of the quarantine lab. Shauna watched in horror as a brown form advanced through the entrance, its centipede-like body adorned with eye stalks, and all 2 human arms jutting from its back. For a moment, she was certain it was staring at her. Even across the 15-meter distance, its dark blue eyes seemed to pierce her consciousness, ripping and tearing at her mind. Another sound caught her attention, but she didn't dare break her stare with the thing. She needn't have bothered anyway. The creature's eye stalks flipped toward the containment room, its segmented arms flicking at the air in an uncanny pantomime of human movement. The thing she'd named Prime had changed direction and curled its body around the lab to face the containment area. The ever-present wave of static suddenly ceased, leaving Shauna and the scientists gaping at the sight of Tob. It had consumed the bodies and now appeared as a quivering lump of glistening dark matter. Freed from the danger of the UV lamps, Tob had returned to liquid form. Its surface puckered and bubbled. A crab-like eye stalk rose from its center, a dead black orb rotating at high speed at its end. The clicking of dozens of tiny, spindly legs on the metal made her shift her eyes to Prime. The creature had rounded the edge of the lab, its eye stalks pointing at Tob like spears. The two creatures stared at one another in a deathly silence. Shauna held her breath as she waited for something to happen. The sound of Neil quietly sobbing in terror, barely registering in her consciousness. Crunching and crackling finally broke the tableau. Prime's centipede body morphed before her eyes, the legs retracting into its middle, the creature slowly lowering itself to the metal deck. Prime's elongated body widened, its surface hardening into a shell. 4 new legs, each crackling and spitting as it grew a new carapace, extruded from the squat shape. Instead of looking like arachnid limbs, these were more mammalian, the hind legs composed of joints and ending in wide analogs of human feet. Prime's body had reformed into something that looked like a human being had been stretched and pulled, the nose replaced by a misshapen snout, sporting black, glistening teeth. Now the size of a massive grizzly bear and just as thick, the creature raised its head in a silent howl, its shell wriggling and writhing as short spikes appeared on its back and sides. Tob quickly reformed itself, crab-like legs sprouting from the lump of dark ooze, chelicera and mandibles taking shape as it widened and lengthened its body. 3 legs sprouted from its bottom and lifted a malformed torso into the air. The wide head sat atop the short, squat, thick body, a pair of human-like limbs crunching and crackling as they pushed through the outer shell. The nightmarish thing stared at its offspring with alien hunger. As if on a silent count, Prime pushed with its hind legs and leaped nearly 3 meters through the air, crashing down into the metal floor like a sledgehammer. Tob pulled itself forward on 2 legs, a third limb dragging behind. Tob's taloned, thick arms reached forward as if hoping for a deadly embrace. It didn't have long to wait. Prime sprang forward again, its front legs kicking upward as it moved through the air, and hit Tob like a linebacker. The noise of brittle eggshells smashing into one another filled the air, along with a cloud of dark crumbs and particles. Tob fell backward to the steel deck with a crash. Prime, the 4-legged monstrosity, sat on Tob's torso, Prime's multiple arms rising and falling like hammers as it pounded at the creature's carapace. A new, short, broad limb extruded from Tob's torso, pushed upward like a piston, and sent Prime flying off its chest. Prime landed on all fours, its arms shortening and its quizzical blue eyes staring at its progenitor. Tob shook, its 3 legs retracting into its torso, and its shape was already beginning to change. Readying itself for another attack, Prime lurched forward and to the side, doing its best to flank Tob and avoid a counterattack. But Tob had plans of its own. Tob's foot-like appendage tapered to a spear point and swung to the side, tracking its assailant. Its surface crackled as it reformed, the square's torso becoming a squat, oblong body. 6 legs sprouted from its flanks, their ends wide and flat. A pair of dark fangs, their color lightening as they hardened, jutted upward from a wet maw. A new appendage grew to match its spear, but this one looked more like a 3-fingered gripping hand, each digit ending in a hooked talon. Now looking more like a misshapen roach or beetle, Tob scuttled backward as Prime approached. Prime's arms raised upward like scorpion tails, the appendages flicking and slashing at the air in random arcs. Tob retreated, its spear and gripping hand continuing to track those of its quadruped enemy. Without warning, Prime leaped forward, snout down, arms held at a nearly 90-degree angle. Tob prepared for the attack and used its gripping appendage to shove the creature aside and jab with its spear. The sharp limb met Prime with the sound of a desiccated locust shell crushed beneath a heavy boot. Prime fell to the side, its shell quickly regrowing bits of shattered carapace. Tob reached for it, but Prime danced away with a grace Shauna hadn't expected possible. Tob moved sideways, its legs clicking loudly on the metal floor. The point of its spear looked dull and sheared. The limb retracted a few centimeters, and the point reappeared and renewed. Tob's body seemed to shorten, the crackle and spit from a grease fire filling the air. Prime had shrunk in the same manner. A hand grabbed her shoulder. "Shauna, get down!" Kate yelled. She barely noticed. Prime circled Tob, the roach-like thing scuttling to keep its fanged mouth aimed squarely at its attacker. Prime lunged, but Tob moved backward in a flash, its gripping hand slapping the side of Prime's snout with a crunch of spring ice. Hard, dark matter puffed in a cloud as part of Prime's head disappeared, revealing a bubbling cauldron of black. Prime shuffled backward as if stunned, a shell forming around the glistening hole. Tob immediately shot forward and rammed the quadruped in the flank, knocking it sprawling. The spear reared back before piercing Prime's hindquarters. A cloud of crumbs so small they looked like black mist exploded off Prime's back. One of its legs cracked at the base and folded beneath it. Tob grasped Prime by its short neck, and the digits pressed into Prime's outer shell. Prime's flank shivered as a mouth with serrated teeth extended from its torso and bit like a snapping turtle. Black sawdust spat off Tob's third segment, the leg disappearing, leaving a large, ragged hole in the beetle creature's armor. Tob reared back, or tried to, but Prime held it fast, its mammalian features melting into arms and tentacles. It plunged them inside the opening and widened it with rips and tears. Tob's remaining legs pulled back, but Prime extruded a new appendage resembling a mosquito proboscis. The beetle shrunk in size, its shell fading into a glassy liquid while Prime drank it. Shauna watched Prime grow, its surface rippling and bubbling as it consumed its parent. A moment later, Tob transformed into a puddle of liquid before Prime rushed forward to absorb Tob's remains. Prime's body crackled with static as it widened and lengthened. It rose from the floor on two legs, its abdomen and chest festooned with appendages. It turned toward her. Then everything went blue. She suddenly found herself looking at nothing, no creature. It had been there, and then someone grabbed her shoulder and pulled her backward. She stumbled and fell to her ass, her hands scrambling to find purchase. A yell of anger and fear erupted behind her, and something flew over her head. An incendiary grenade exploded with a fiery bang. A set of hands grabbed her shoulder and dragged her screaming through the open blast door. Another grenade flew over her head, her view of the ceiling becoming unfocused. She dropped her head just in time to see something rounding the corner of the burning crates, its silhouette undeniable. Prime walked on two legs, 4 arms growing out of his torso, the top 2 flexing their taloned digits, the lower 2 looking like octopus tentacles. The other grenade detonated out of sight, and a secondary explosion followed close behind. The enormous, thick steel door closed with a bang. Something crashed into it from the other side, the boom echoing in the elevator corridor. Hands lifted her to her feet. She turned and saw Catfish, his head slightly bowed and panting like a dog. He was covered in lacerations, clothes streaked with grease and filth, and clutched a grenade in one hand. His boot was melted and half broken. A wave of dizziness spread over her, and she wobbled as Neil and Kate took her weight. Catfish jerked a thumb to the elevator. "Move," he said through gritted teeth. After 2 steps, Shauna finally got her feet under her. Kate moved away, Neil's arm remaining around Shauna's waist. A moment later, Kate had Catfish by the hip, one of his arms over her shoulder. They stepped as though she were a crutch.
"The elevator is unlocked,"
Moore said from the speakers, her voice even and calm.
"I suggest you hurry."
A new set of klaxons erupted from the ceiling.
"Warning, facility destruction in 3 minutes.
A robotic voice bellowed.
Evacuate the facility immediately."
Unable to hear anything over the sirens, the 4 scientists and Catfish made their way to the elevator. With its doors open and interior lights flashing an angry red, the steel box suddenly looked safe and inviting instead of like a claustrophobic coffin. Once inside, the door descended and closed. The elevator's floor rumbled beneath her, and the group jerked as one as it rose much faster than normal. A moment later, the door opened to a new set of sirens.
"In 2 minutes.
An electronic voice calmly shouted through the speakers.
Evacuate the facility immediately."
2 men dressed in military uniforms stood on either side of the elevator. When the door fully opened, they reached into the car and plucked Catfish out as though he were a pile of laundry. One soldier lifted him onto the other's back. "Hurry!" someone yelled, and the soldier with Catfish walked quickly through the pulse of red lights that seemed much brighter than the overheads. The robotic voice droned as the group moved past the conference room and into the lobby. The heavy glass doors hung wide open, and another group of soldiers waited outside. Several of them carried large incinerators, and a turret had been placed several meters away from the doors, a weapon's long barrel covering the exit. The man carrying Catfish continued ahead as though being chased by something unseen. Shauna felt like she was walking through a dream beneath the cold, rainy fall sky. The group made their way to a large, thick green tarp. Neil led Shauna to a canvas lawn chair and carefully guided her into it. A hand reached for hers. She turned dumbly in that direction and looked into Catfish's pale, grizzled, bloody face. He smiled at her, a tear dripping from one eye. "Found you," he whispered. She squeezed his fingers and held them tightly. A man appeared at Catfish's side, a medical caduceus on his sleeve. He rolled back Catfish's shirt and plunged a needle into him. Catfish turned to look at the man for a moment before his face slackened. Her daze evaporated as he closed his eyes. "What? Wait!" A hand touched her shoulder. She whipped around and looked up into Moore's deadpan expression. "Just a sedative," she said. "We need him immobilized until we check him out." Shauna brushed the woman's hand from her shoulder. "Check him for what? He can't be infected." Moore nodded. "No, he can't, but he's damaged his leg again, and we need to check his burns. We don't want him getting sepsis." A swirl of unreality swept over her. "Dr. Moore," a soldier said, "all personnel evacuated." Moore didn't shift her gaze from Shauna's. "Thank you, Lieutenant. You may proceed." Klaxons went off around them, the air splitting with their low to high-pitched swell. A grin spread slowly over Moore's face, and she squeezed Shauna's shoulder like a mother reassuring her daughter. "It's done," she said. The ground trembled beneath them, the tarp shaking off a storm of droplets. A muted roar underlay the sound of the rain and the whisper of a breeze. The trembling ebbed, and disappeared along with the last of the sound. The din of crumbling concrete, an entire foundation crackling as it fell apart, filled the air. Shauna turned to look at the building they'd spent so much time in. The facility's walls had collapsed into a pile of rubble, fractured wood, chunks of sheetrock, and metal. Black smoke billowed from the building's corpse like the dying gasps of a giant animal. Soldiers slowly moved forward and took positions around the collapsed husk, their incinerator pilot lights glowing blue in the twilight. "Ah," Moore said quietly. "You think that looks bad. Imagine what the quarantine level looks like." Shauna met her gaze again. "What did you do?" "Detonated the thermite charges. Turned the entire floor into an inferno before setting off multiple Semtex charges. After it blew, the lab level got the same treatment. Then engineering," she shrugged, "was the plan all along." "How do you know it's destroyed?" Moore bit her lip. "I don't. We never will, not unless it reappears. Until then," she rubbed her arms as though to warm them, "we'll search for it once the facility is pronounced safe to examine." "That could take weeks," Shauna said dumbly. Moore turned her head and looked back at the smoking wreck. "It will take weeks, but that'll be my problem." She turned to Shauna. "Rest. We're taking all of you to the infirmary, and we need to get your concussion looked at." Shauna blinked. "I don't have a concussion. My head is fine." "Okay," Moore said, "but we're going to check you anyway." Her voice had become strange in its cadence, as though it were more of a question than a statement. A soldier with a caduceus appeared in front of her and held out 2 small cups. "Take this," he said. One paper cup held 2 pills, the other water. "I don't want you going into shock." Moore's hand squeezed her shoulder. "Take them, Shauna. This will all be over soon." Shauna took the pills, that dreamlike shroud returning and drowning her thoughts. After swallowing and polishing off the paper cup of water, the medic smiled at her and took the cups. "You let me know if your head starts hurting, okay?" "Feel woozy." "That's the shock I'm worried about," he said. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers pressing down on her vein. He peered at his watch, followed the second hand with his eyes. Finally, he released her arm and nodded. "You're okay. We'll get you warm." His words had become fuzzy, distant, as though he were speaking through gauze. Her vision wavered slightly, and the pressure on her shoulder increased. "Almost over," Moore was saying. Her voice faded into silence, and soon the rest of the world did too.